Wow. During the last 2 sessions, including today, we went through some very technical stuff. As you recall, Laban had agreed that Jacob could breed, could take care of his stock, of his cattle, goats, sheep, and take whatever is multicolored, spotted, or speckled for his own. But first he took away all the spotted and speckled ones and separated him by a 3 days' journey. Now Laban thought he had him at a disadvantage. But Jacob used his skills to take the solid colored, the white sheep, the brown goats, or the solid colored animals that he had, to produce speckled ones of his own. And God helped him with that, as we discovered during our previous session. Today, we close chapter 30 with 3 verses, and then we'll unpack them. Verse 41 to 43. And it came to pass, whensoever the stronger cattle did conceive, that Jacob laid the rods or the branches before the eyes of the cattle in the gutters, that they might conceive among the rods. But when the cattle were feeble, he put them not in. So the feebler ones were Laban's, and the stronger ones belonged to Jacob. And the man, Jacob, increased exceedingly, and had much cattle, and maidservants, and manservants, and camels, and donkeys. So, as was mentioned previously, but stated here in verse 41, it came to pass, whensoever the stronger cattle did conceive, that Jacob laid the rods before the eyes of the cattle in the gutters, that they might conceive among the rods. So he placed them around where the feeding trough was, so that they would see them. See, now Jacob experimented to see how he could get most for himself. And there's no denying that. Jacob only used the rods in the stronger animals, that's true. So their offspring would also be strong. As we said before, it was thought that when the strong sheep and goats and livestock would have the striped and partially peeled rods before their eyes, they might conceive and bring forth partly colored ones, such as were robust and strong like themselves. Now the Hebrew word that is translated stronger is mekusharoth. Mekusharoth. I know, it's a funny sounding word. It means, well, it's understood by several of the ancient interpreters as signifying the early, firstborn, the early spring cattle. They were the strongest. Now, there's another expression, and it's called atufim. Atufim. It means feeble and weak. It was always considered the earlier ones that were born in March were strong, and the ones later on were considered the weaker stock. So, now this does not apply merely to two births from the same female in 1 year. Actually, that has happened. Female sheep have born one litter or one sheep or two sheep early on in March, and then another lamb later on in September. So that has happened, but that's not what this was talking about. The stronger and weaker was more particularly referring to the earlier and late lambs in the same year. The better way of putting this is the first and stronger, or the delayed and weaker. I don't understand all this because I'm just a Bible teacher, right? Now, those born at the very beginning of spring were in every way more valuable than those which were born later in the same spring. Jacob was a scientist in the truest sense of the word. Jacob, an experienced shepherd, practiced what we call selective breeding. And he experimented on the sheep to see how they could best breed. And as such, he was very careful not to try his experiments with the late produced sheep, goats, or cattle, knowing that they would produce probably some degenerate breed. But with the early cattle, which were strong and able to withstand his experimentation, his breed improved. So was it just an accident that the multicolored offspring were strong and vigorous? Like we discussed in the last session, God had his back. Too much inbreeding for the solid-colored animals. So too much inbreeding to try to produce single-hued offspring often caused weaknesses and negative mutations. We know that now. And Jacob was discovering it as he was experimenting on the sheep. So you see, the whole flock of Laban must have been much weaker, while Jacob's flock was preserved in a state of increasing perfection. Jacob's breeding of the best of the flock produced higher quality offspring. Isn't it amazing that mating by many of the shepherds was indiscriminate? But Jacob targeted strong against the strong so that you'd produce stronger, produce a more stable breed. So we find the feebler were Laban's and the stronger were Jacob's. And not only were Jacob's flocks more numerous than Laban's, but they were of better quality. We just said that, didn't we? So Isaac increased exceedingly and had much cattle and maidservants and menservants and camels and donkeys. So as the flocks grew, more manpower and beasts of burden were required to keep the business growing, and his wealth and circle of influence increased exceedingly. Now, to help me write these last two commentary sessions, I had to use an outside source because I really couldn't understand what was going on. You read and you reread and you're going, what is going on here? So I was able to use Adam Clarke's commentary on the Bible, published way back between 1810 to 1826. But you see, even though Mr. Clarke had an intimate knowledge of shepherding, neither Mr. Clarke nor I could fully grasp Jacob's consummate knowledge of his selective breeding theories and practices. Like I said, after all, I'm just a Bible teacher. But the truth, folks, the truth is that Jewish and Christian breeders have attended to some form of a breeding plan based on what Jacob here stated, and they improved their breeding qualities to a most eminent degree. What does that tell us? It tells us that the Bible is not just some religious book. The Bible touches on some principles of science that no other so-called sacred books ever do. It's all I can say is, what a fund of instruction upon almost every subject is to be found in the sacred writings of our scriptures. The Bible isn't just a religious book. It's the book revealed